The private dining room at Lakeland felt more like a tomb than a celebratory suite. The walls were lined with silk damask, the air heavy with the scent of roasted duck, vintage Bordeaux, and the unmistakable, cold vibration of an impending storm. Frank Costello sat at the head of the table, his hands resting lightly on the white linen, watching the man across from him. That man was Tommy the Gent Luchis, not a rival, but a protégé, a man Costello had mentored for 15 years. They were supposed to be celebrating a new union contract that would funnel millions into the commission's coffers. But as the waiter poured a 1945 Chateau Lafite, Costello noticed that Tommy's hand was trembling just enough to make the crystal glass chime against the silver coaster. In the underworld, a tremor like that is as loud as a scream. Costello didn't say a word. He simply picked up his glass, swirled the deep red liquid, and took a slow, deliberate sip. He knew that outside the restaurant, the city was moving according to a plan Tommy had helped Vito Genovese set in motion. He knew that tonight was supposed to be his last meal. But what Tommy didn't know was that Costello had already rewritten the menu. "You look tense, Tommy," Costello said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to fill every corner of the silent room. A man who has just made $10 million should be smiling. Unless, of course, he's wondering if he'll live long enough to spend it. The comment hung in the air like a noose. Tommy forced a laugh, but it died in his throat when he met Costello's eyes. Costello's gaze wasn't angry, it was clinical. It was the look of a scientist watching a laboratory rat realize the maze has no exit. Tommy reached for his wine, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors. He was waiting for the signal. He was waiting for the two gunmen Genovese had promised would burst in during the dessert course. But the doors remained shut. The restaurant, usually buzzing with the sounds of New York's elite, was unnervingly quiet. Costello had bought the entire floor for the night, but not for privacy. He had bought it for a stage. As the second course arrived, a delicate plate of oysters, Costello began to tell a story. He talked about the early days in the 1920s, about the loyalty of the old Unione Siciliana, and about the one thing that always destroyed an empire, the belief that the apprentice is smarter than the master. Vito thinks in lead and gunpowder, Tommy. He's a primitive. He thinks that if you remove the head, the body belongs to you, Costello said, sliding an oyster shell across the table toward his friend. But what Vito doesn't understand, and what I thought I taught you, is that the head is just an ornament. The real power is in the nervous system. The unions, the judges, the police captains, they don't answer to a title. They answer to me. And they always will, even if I'm 6 feet under. Tommy's face turned a ghostly shade of grey. He realized then that the silence in the restaurant wasn't a coincidence. The gunmen weren't coming. If you are watching this and you realize that the most terrifying form of power isn't the man who carries the gun, but the man who makes the gun disappear, then you are starting to see the world through the eyes of the Prime Minister. Most people focus on their attack, but the elite focus on an environment. Costello didn't need to wear a bulletproof vest, he simply ensured that the bullets never reached the room. If you want to learn how to create an aura of invincibility that makes your enemy surrender before the first shot is even fired, if you want to master the art of that psychological trap, then you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now and join a brotherhood that values intellectual dominance over raw force. Like this video to show that you recognize the genius of the non-violent execution. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type architect in all caps. Let's see who among you is ready to build a legacy that can't be torn down by a traitor's bullet. Now, let's go back to the table, where Tommy Luchis was about to realize the true price of his betrayal. The main course was served, a thick, blood-red steak, but Tommy couldn't touch his fork. The weight of Costello's presence was physically crushing him. He looked at the man he had called uncle for a decade and saw a predator he no longer recognized. "Why haven't you killed me yet, Frank?" Tommy finally whispered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "You know. I can see it in your eyes. You know everything. Why the dinner? And why the wine?" Costello leaned back, the light from the candles reflecting off his gold signet ring. "Because, Tommy, a quick death is a mercy you haven't earned. And because I wanted to hear you say it. I wanted to see the exact moment your ego collapsed and you realized that Vito Genovese didn't buy your loyalty, he bought your suicide note." Costello reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He laid it on the table between them. "This is the ledger for the Brooklyn docks," Costello said quietly. "The one you told Vito didn't exist. The one you promised him you could recreate once I was gone. Do you know what's on page 42, Tommy?" Tommy shook his head, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's a list of payments," Costello continued. "Payments made to your brother, your cousin, and your mistress. Payments that came from a special fund I set up 5 years ago. I didn't just give you a career, Tommy. I made your entire family dependent on my shadow. If I die tonight, those payments stop. And the people I pay to keep your family safe? They'll become the people who come for them. You didn't just betray me, you auctioned off your own blood." The realization hit Tommy Luchis like a physical blow to the stomach. He had thought he was being a rebel, a new age boss taking what was his. But he was just a child playing in a house that Costello had built, wired, and rigged with explosives. The traitor began to weep, not for his own life, but for the sheer, staggering scale of his own incompetence. He looked at Costello and saw the truth: you don't replace a man like Frank Costello. You either serve him, or you cease to exist. "Vito told me you were soft," Tommy sobbed, his head bowing over his untouched steak. "He said the Senate hearings broke you. He said you were a retired man living on a reputation." Costello smiled then, a cold, thin line that held no warmth. "Vito confuses peace with weakness. It's the mistake that will eventually put him in a cage for the rest of his life." Costello stood up, signaled to the waiter to bring the check, and leaned over the table, his face inches from the man who had tried to murder him. "I'm leaving now, Tommy. The doors are no longer locked. You can walk out of here, or you can stay and finish your wine. But before I go, I want you to remember one thing: I didn't catch you because I'm lucky. I caught you because I designed you. I knew you would betray me the day I met you, and I've been preparing this dinner for 15 years. Costello turned to leave, but Tommy reached out and grabbed his sleeve, his eyes wide with a haunting, desperate clarity. He whispered the last words he would ever say to the Prime Minister, words that would echo in Costello's mind until his own deathbed. The traitor leaned in, his voice a ghost of a sound, and said the words that would haunt the history of the 5 families: "Frank, even if you kill us all, the world you built is already dead. We didn't betray you for the money. We betrayed you because we couldn't stand being small in your shadow anymore. Even in the dark, you're the only thing anyone sees." Costello didn't flinch. He pulled his sleeve away, straightened his jacket, and walked out into the cool New York night, leaving Tommy Luchis alone with $1 million meal and a life that was already over. The betrayal was settled, but the word stayed behind, a chilling reminder that the greatest enemies are the ones we create ourselves by being too successful. The night of the traitor had ended, but the war for the soul of the city was just getting started. When Frank Costello stepped out of the brass-trimmed doors of Lakeland, the New York night air felt sharper, cleaner, and more decisive than it had in decades. Behind him, the private dining room had been transformed from a place of luxury into a psychological slaughterhouse. He didn't look back. He didn't need to see the wreckage of Tommy Luchis' spirit to know that the job was done. As he settled into the plush leather of his black Cadillac, he didn't give his driver a single instruction. The driver, a man who had seen 3 decades of shadows, simply put the car in gear. The city was a machine that functioned on Costello's pulse, and tonight, every gear was turning in perfect, lethal synchronization. While Tommy was left at the table to choke on the final dregs of a vintage Bordeaux, Costello was already initiating the erasure. This wasn't just about a single traitor, it was about proving that the Prime Minister could dismantle a conspiracy without ever having to raise his voice. The Cadillac glided through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan like a predator through deep water. As they crossed 57th Street, the silent gears of Costello's infrastructure began to grind. He didn't use hitmen for this phase, he used the paper killers. In the underworld, people think the end comes from a Tommy gun in an alley, but Costello knew the real end comes when your name no longer carries credit. By 2 a.m., while Tommy was wandering the empty restaurant floors in a daze, Costello's phone calls had reached the inner sanctums of the city's power. The union accounts that Tommy Luchis managed? Frozen. The silent partnerships he held in the garment district? Terminated. The police captains who had been taking supplemental income from Tommy? They were told that the well had run dry. In one single, bloodless sweep, Costello had stripped Tommy of his armor. He had turned a boss-in-waiting into a man who couldn't even buy a pack of cigarettes without someone's permission. This was the Costello purge, surgical, invisible, and absolute. By the time the sun began to gray the horizon over the East River, the word had spread through every social club from East Harlem to South Brooklyn. The message wasn't that Tommy Luchis was dead, it was that Tommy Luchis was done. In the Mafia, being done is a fate far worse than being hit. A hit makes you a martyr, being done makes you a ghost. Costello had orchestrated a total social and financial blackout. He knew that Vito Genovese would be watching, waiting to see if Costello would strike back with fire. By refusing to use violence, Costello made Genovese look like a primitive child playing with matches. He proved that the commission wasn't a gang, it was a corporate state, and he was the chairman of the board. He was teaching the next generation that loyalty isn't just about respect. It's about the sheer, terrifying reality that without the sun, everything in the garden withers. Tommy Luchis finally emerged from the restaurant just as the street cleaners were starting their rounds. He expected to see a black sedan waiting for him. He expected the flash of a muzzle or the cold steel of a garrote. But the street was empty. His own car was gone. His bodyguards had vanished into the morning mist. He stood on the sidewalk of 55th Street, a man in a $3,000 suit with nowhere to go. He realized then that Costello's mercy was the most brutal punishment of all. He had been left alive to witness his own irrelevance. He tried to call Vito Genovese from a public booth. But the man who had promised him the world didn't even pick up the phone. Genovese had no use for a failure, and Costello had ensured that Tommy's failure was public, pathetic, and permanent. The ultimate victory isn't when your enemy dies. It's when your enemy lives long enough to realize that the world has forgotten they ever existed. To kill a man is a momentary act, to erase him is an eternal statement. If you are watching this and you are beginning to feel the weight of the invisible hand, then you are learning the true language of influence. Most people think that to be powerful, you have to be the loudest person in the room. But Frank Costello proved that the most powerful person is the one who can make the room disappear. He didn't just survive an assassination attempt, he turned the attempt into a recruitment poster for his own invincibility. If you want to master the art of strategic withdrawal, how to let your enemies destroy themselves through their own greed, then you are in the right place. Subscribe right now to join the only community that deconstructs the cold, hard logic of the world's most effective leaders. Like this video to show that you choose the invisible war over the loud massacre. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type "ghost" in all caps. Let's see who among you understands that the most lethal weapon is the one you never see coming. Now, let's see the final. Haunting conclusion of Tommy Luchis' long night. As the morning light hit the windows of the Majestic, Frank Costello sat in his library with a glass of warm milk, his trademark drink for a settled stomach. He wasn't celebrating. He was thinking about Tommy's final words, "We betrayed you because we couldn't stand being small in your shadow." It was a profound realization for the Prime Minister. He had spent his life building a shadow so vast and so protective that the men inside it had forgotten what the sun felt like. They hadn't turned on him because they hated him, they turned on him because they needed to feel big. And in the process, they had proven exactly how small they really were. Costello realized that leadership wasn't just about control, it was about the burden of being the only one who truly understood the price of the peace. Tommy Luchis didn't die that night. He didn't die for a long time. But he was never the gent again. He spent the rest of his years as a shadow in the back of smoke-filled rooms, a man who was allowed to exist but never allowed to lead. He became a living reminder to every young soldier in New York, never mistake a man's silence for his surrender. Costello had allowed him to keep his life, but he had taken his soul. It was a trade that Tommy would regret every time he saw Costello's name in the papers, a name that remained synonymous with the city itself long after the traitors had been buried in unmarked graves. The Lakeland dinner became a ghost story told in the underworld for decades. It was the night that Prime Minister showed that he didn't need a gun to win a war. He just needed a table, a bottle of wine, and the cold, unwavering truth of who he was. Frank Costello died in 1973, a man who had successfully navigated the most treacherous waters in American history. He left behind a legacy of civilized crime, but more importantly, he left behind a lesson in the psychology of power. He proved that the person who controls the narrative controls the world. He didn't just beat Tommy Luchis, he outfought him, outlasted him, and ultimately, he outlived him in the only way that matters, as a legend. As the final credits of this story roll, remember that the shadow isn't something to fear, it's something to master. Like Costello, you must learn to build your empire so deeply into the fabric of your environment that you become unmovable. You don't fight the storm, you become the weather. The night of the traitor ended with a quiet sunrise, but the echoes of that dinner still resonate today in every boardroom and every backroom where real power is exercised. Stay sharp, stay calculated, and never forget, the most dangerous seat at the table is the one you think you've already won. We'll see you in the next chapter of the Prime Minister's rise.